Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
First to the Brexit bill, which allows the government to trigger Article 50, the formal process for Britain to leave the EU. This week, the House of Lords gets their turn to debate the process after MPs passed it without amendment earlier this month. But the bill is not expected to get as easy a ride in the second chamber. The EU notification of withdrawal bill will start its passage through the House of Lords today, with around 190 peers registered to speak on the two-day debate on the general principles of the bill. It will then be sent for detailed scrutiny at the committee stage next week. If the bill is not amended, then it could theoretically be approved by the Lords at third reading on the 7th of March, becoming law shortly afterwards. But two amendments seem to be gathering support amongst the Lords. One on the status of EU nationals currently living in the UK, and a second insisting Parliament gets a meaningful vote on any exit deal before it is agreed. Now, if either of these amendments pass, then the bill is sent back to the Commons, which can vote to remove any amendments before the whole process starts over again. If that leads to an extended period when the bill ping-pongs between the two houses, that could delay the triggering of Article 50, something Prime Minister Theresa May has promised to do by the end of March. In the event of deadlock, the only way to force the bill through is by evoking the Parliament Act. But that can only be done after the whole process has been held up for a year. Yesterday, former Labour Business Secretary Lord Mandelson took to the airwaves to encourage his fellow members of the House of Lords to not give in too quickly.
And what we're saying is that what Parliament must agree is to say, look at the final deal, look at the outcome of the negotiation, and if it's not good for Britain, if it's potentially going to be a disaster for our economy, send the government back to the negotiating table.
Do we then get a long period of ping-pong, or does the House of Lords say, well, hold on a second, the referendum was clear, the Commons is clear, we are the unelected House, it's time to give up?
At the end of the day, the House of Commons must prevail because it is the elected chamber.
My question is, how long is the day?
But I hope the House of Lords will not throw in the towel early.
Peter Mandelson there. Well, we're joined now from the Lords lobby in Parliament by the Shadow Leader of the Lords, Baroness Angela Smith, and by the Leader of the Liberal Democrats in the Lords, Lord Dick Newby. Welcome to both of you. Angela Smith, Peter Mandelson, as we've just heard there yesterday, saying the Lords shouldn't throw in the towel too quickly. Do you agree with him?
Well, we haven't even started the process yet, and I think it's something you said at the beginning, Joe, when you said about would we delay the process. This isn't a delay of the process. Us debating the issue, looking at amendments, possibly passing amendments, is part of the process. And whilst there weren't any amendments in the House of Commons, there were changes made. The government gave guarantees on certain issues. I think those guarantees should be part of the bill and not just from a government say-so. If we've seen with Alf Dubs's child refugees issue, you can't always trust the government to say we're going to do something, put in parliamentary engagement, put in a meaningful vote on the face of the bill would be a very sensible way forward. And I'm hopeful, I'd like the government to say, well, we've agreed to do that, let's put it on the bill, and then we prove that we really do mean to keep our word on this.
Right, and if the amendments being put forward on the meaningful parliamentary vote to come sometime before a sort of final deadline, and also on guarantees for EU nationals, if those amendments were to fail in the Lords, would you vote against the Brexit bill?
No, I think we will do our best to get amendments, and I think that it's possible there'll be amendments. We won't be voting. It's been made very, very clear across the House, from all sides of the House, we're not going to sabotage, we're not going to block this bill. But we do think it would be completely wrong, and actually I'd say it would be constitutionally irresponsible for us just to say to Theresa May, bye-bye, here's the bill, go off for 2 years and come back then with a deal. There should be parliamentary engagement throughout that process.
All right,
I have to say I am optimistic the government should, because they said they will, put that on the face of the bill.
All right, well, let's take those two amendments. Dick Newby, would you vote against the Brexit bill if those two amendments that I mentioned earlier fail?
Well, I don't think it's going to come to that. I think we're going to be successful in getting those amendments through. And,
right.
Of course, that's the role of the House of Lords, which is to ask the government and the Commons to think again if we think they've got it wrong. And we clearly do think they've got it wrong on these issues, and I'm sure that's the majority view in the House of Lords.
Right, and so you think the numbers are there and those amendments will pass. And just to remind viewers, that's an amendment on a meaningful parliamentary vote at the end of the negotiations, which would give Parliament the chance to say to the government, you'll have to go back and renegotiate because we don't think that's a good enough deal, and also on the guaranteed rights of EU citizens. If the Lords, as you say, passes those amendments, Dick Newby, and the Commons then later rejects them, will you then dig your heels in when it comes back to the Lords?
Well, at the end of the day, as Angela said, the view of the Commons prevails. And ping-pong, even when we've had repeated ping-pong, which we did under, for example, the house arrest proposals under the Blair government, is a relatively quick procedure. So how far the Lords will resist it, I'm not absolutely sure. But whatever the Lords does, the government's under no threat whatsoever that this bill won't get through in plenty of time before the 31st of March.
I see. So even if you were then to dig your heels in, if it came back to the Lords, you still think that timetable would be kept, but you do actually anticipate some form of ping-pong?
I do anticipate some form of ping-pong, absolutely.
Right, and do you agree with that, Angela Smith, that it could go back several times before the end of March?
I don't know about several times. It's difficult to know or judge that yet. But just sending something to the Commons is part of ping-pong. But I have to say to you, Joe, the fact that the government has set this deadline for the end of March and is trying to rush the bill through, it was this government that spent 3 months in the courts allowing judges to debate the issue at great expense when we could have spent that time in Parliament. But I don't see any difficulty with the deadline that's been set by the end of March, but it has been a truncated process. We're likely to be here beyond midnight tonight and tomorrow night, possibly next week as well. So we will do our job. We're not going to be forced into not properly debate an issue because the government's truncated timetable.
Right. Now, you said, Dick Newby, that you think those amendments will pass. Otherwise, you are happy, are you, to trigger Article 50 as the leader of the Liberal Democrats in the Lords?
Well, they're not the only amendments that we're going to be pushing very hard. We
Right.
have an amendment down to give the people a final say in a referendum when we know what the Brexit deal is, and we're going to be working very hard across the House of Lords to do that. There are other amendments around reporting and various other issues which we support as well. So those two that you mentioned are ones where the government's clearly vulnerable, but I wouldn't say they're the only ones where the government's vulnerable.
Right. Do you agree that the government would be vulnerable on a second referendum, Angela Smith, in the way Dick Newby has described at the end of the process?
I don't think that is likely to pass. We don't know yet. We'll wait and see. But who knows what's going to happen in the next 2 years? And I think the important thing at the moment is to get a process going by which there is parliamentary engagement. If there's to be a meaningful vote...
What does that mean, Angela Smith, for you?
Well, a meaningful vote for me is that we vote before the European Parliament votes, and we have the information throughout the process. But if the deal isn't a good one, or it's looking, really an unsatisfactory position for the UK, that won't be news to the government in 2 years' time. That will be something that becomes evident over some period of time, and that's why the parliamentary engagement is so important.
So what do you want, though, then, for the government to write on the face of the bill in terms of that you could then, in essence, keep going back to the drawing board with the deal?
You can't keep going back onto the drawing board. What you'd have to do is actually ask the other European countries to extend the time, all 27 of them. But I think the key of all of this is that throughout the process, the government should be engaging with Parliament, using the expertise from Parliament to try and get the best deal possible. It would be pretty drastic, wouldn't it, if at the end of 2 years, the government and Parliament were saying this is too awful. So the point and the key thing is to have engagement to get the best possible deal.
OK, and Dick Newby, do you understand those who say that the Lords shouldn't have any role in terms of holding up what they see as the will of the people?
Well, I understand that view, but as we both said, we're not holding it up. There's a big distinction between amending a bill under a normal timetable and holding it up. We're going to be amending the bill. Frankly, if the House of Lords can't ask the Commons to think again, it might as well pack up its bags and go home.
All right. Well, without being rude, you can do exactly that just for the moment. Thank you both very much.
Not till midnight.
Yes, you've got a long sitting ahead of you. Mr. Raghani, do you have sympathy with their views? Why shouldn't the Lords and Ladies scrutinise this bill and amend it?
It's absolutely their right to scrutinise this bill and see what amendments they want to put forward. But the two amendments that they spoke about, one about EU citizens. Assurances have been given by the Prime Minister and the Minister that these issues will be prioritised in negotiating the best deal possible.
But it could take 2 years. People could be waiting as EU nationals to hear their fate.
But then you also heard from the Liberal leader, that they would like to negotiate for as long as it takes to get the best deal possible, and then have a number of referendum until the Liberal Democrats are happy with whatever outcome that they think best suits the country. The country has decided. We have had extensive debates in the House of Commons, and it has passed with an overwhelming majority to enable us to trigger Article 50, to begin these negotiations and to see what kind of deal and the best deal that we can get.
I mean, in a way, they are at least trying to scrutinise and amend the bill in a way that the opposition failed to do in the Commons. There was a blank cheque, to some extent, given to the government.
No, we did try. I mean, hundreds
of course,
of amendments.
and the numbers don't work.
Of course, we tried. And I think it's very interesting that they picked out these two issues, because I think these were the issues. I said it in this studio first on the day the bill was published. I expected a coalition across party lines. People who've been living here and working here and made their homes here for many years shouldn't be used as a bargaining chip in this. I hope the government thinks again about that. The other issue is, can EU countries say, yes, of course, your nationals, British nationals in our country, will be entitled to stay? We will be a non-EU country. The policy of all EU countries is that non-EU countries are decided by each country. So how can they collectively make that decision anyway? I think the best thing for us to do is to take the moral high ground and say, this is what we're doing with your citizens, and to start the negotiations on that, I think, very fruitful and very positive.
What do you make then of
line.
Peter Mandelson's intervention yesterday about encouraging his colleagues in the House of Lords not to throw the towel in too early, to put up a fight over
Well, you're
this?
absolutely right. Peter was just talking plain common sense. These two amendments are the important ones, I think. There are views on all sides of the House about these two amendments. And of course the Lords, that's their job. I think they should be elected rather than appointed, but I agree there should be a second chamber. And the job of a second chamber is to scrutinise. And that's what they're doing.
Do you think there'll be a backlash against the Lords? How would you feel about it if they do hold up the bill with amendments?
We'll have to see what happens when the debate begins today. But fundamentally, we have to reflect the will of the people, and the democratically elected parliamentarians have had a huge amount of debates beyond the 2 weeks that we've debated this issue in and out. And I think the House of Lords needs to reflect on how it should scrutinise, but I have confidence that they will do the right thing.
Otherwise?
Well, they have to evaluate what they are there to do, to be honest.
But it's not going to happen. There'll be ping-pong, but it'll be ping-ponged. This is the term for sending the stuff back.
But people aren't going
But it'll be ping-ponged, I guess, once or twice. And the Lords, you heard it from the two leaders there. Obviously, the Conservatives will be the same.
Presumably
There's a large tranche of cross-benchers. But in the end, the mood in the House of Lords is they will not hold this
But that's also because the mood in the country is they do not want this held up. I think over 62% of people just want this now to crack on and for Article 50 to be triggered.
And will Labour MPs in the Commons continue to vote for this if there is a bit of ping-pong from the Lords?
Labour and others. I was quite disappointed that the Conservatives, a few of them rebelled on this issue, but they kept their heads down. I mean, as I say, I think this is a good way to start. And I hope that they think again if the Lords does make this decision. But in the end, I confidently predict March the 7th, this will go through.
Right. And in terms of the amendments, do you think the government should just accept those two that we've talked about?
Well, the government's already said that they will prioritise ensuring the security of EU citizens in this country, but we need the same for British citizens overseas as well. We need to make sure that they're also feeling secure.
But what about a unilateral? What about a unilateral
Well,
stance?
that will happen. But this is what This is
going to happen.
These are the negotiations that will begin. We need to trigger
But
Article
why not
50.
have that stance before the negotiations start and take the moral high ground, as Alan Johnson said?
Because we also need to ensure that our British citizens who are in Europe also have the same security.
So they are a bargaining chip.
These are negotiations. They will begin once we trigger Article 50.
All right, let's talk about Tony Blair, because not everyone welcomed his intervention. Was it a case of, in your mind, the right message and the wrong messenger?
No, I've got a great deal of appreciation for the messenger, but it's certainly the right message. I mean, the message that Tony was putting forward was that it was absolutely right to trigger Article 50. The will of the people must prevail, was his opening remark. It's very much my view as well. As this moves on, you'll see there'll come a time when the British people will have a choice between leaving the European Union and on the terms of the negotiation. And if that's presented, we've been assured in Parliament, both of us, by David Davis, by Theresa May, by Liam Fox, that actually they can negotiate terms that will not be detrimental at all to Britain. We'll have the same, there's numerous quotes about this.
And you believe that?
They've said this to Parliament. Parliament want to actually look at that.
Right, but Tony Blair also said, and certainly implied and hinted heavily, that actually Labour didn't oppose a process that he felt shouldn't have gone ahead at all, and that was what had provoked him standing up and making the speech he did.
I think that's a misreading of his view. Yes, there was a bit in there about Labour, but his opening remarks were the will of the people.
But he did go on about the Labour Party.
Yeah, it wouldn't be. Actually, Tony might be rather embarrassed by this, and so would Jeremy Corbyn. But their views are quite similar in the sense that
Jeremy Corbyn said it wasn't very helpful, his intervention.
Well, I think you should read the speech. Actually, it was very helpful in terms of setting this out. Not least of all, because Tony mentioned the fact that it must be up to Europe to reform as well. If at the end of this package Europe hasn't changed at all, it's still the same rules on free movement, then I think people would choose whatever the alternative is to staying in the EU. If there's been a rethink in Europe about these things, and if they're more closely aligned to the British public's
Is that what you're relying on, that they'll have a rethink on benefits?
I say only this. That campaign changed from the day the Office of National Statistics recorded net migration at its biggest ever level, much bigger than after 2004 when the accession countries came in, a record level of 333,000 by a party under a government that said they would get it down to the tens of thousands. You could feel the arguments.
But Labour, of course, have to take responsibility for not having transitional arrangements right from the very start.
I repeat, 333,000 was higher than after 2000.
So you're saying the number was all right then?
After 6 years of a government, Theresa May as Home Secretary, saying we're going to get this down to the tens of thousands.
All right, we'll leave it there.
The House of Lords has begun debating the bill which will pave the way for the start of Brexit. The legislation passed the Commons with no changes made by MPs, but the government doesn't have a majority in the Lords. Opposition peers are seeking guarantees about the rights of citizens from other EU countries living in Britain. Well, our Deputy Political Editor, John Pienaar, is in central lobby for us now. And John, Theresa May took the unusual step of sitting in on the debate.
She did. It is an important debate. I mean, here at Westminster in the House of Lords, the opponents of Brexit and those who still have deep doubts have begun their final stand. It is a fight they expect to lose, but not before they do all they can to make the government think again about who has a say on the final deal and about how much freedom to give Theresa May and her ministers as they plan for Britain's future after and outside the EU. Blue lights flashing. Theresa May was determined not to miss this. She'd already sent peers a clear message while out campaigning. Brexit's coming. Get out of the way.
Properly, there will be debate and scrutiny in the House of Lords, but I don't want to see anybody holding up what the British people want.
She'd rushed in for a rare appearance by a sitting PM in the Lords. Theresa May perched by tradition on the steps of the throne. 190 peers wanted to speak, a modern record, political big hitters among them, like Labour's Lord Mandelson, wanting a chance for Parliament to change its mind about Brexit.
Yes, they did want to leave the European Union, but they didn't want to turn Britain into a poorer, politically isolated offshore tax haven without reach or influence in the world.
The Lib Dems want a second referendum, though no one now thinks they'll get one.
Brexit is the most important single issue which has faced the country for decades. For many of us, the approach being adopted by the government is little short of disastrous.
It's all right, I've got the French one, so...
These EU migrant workers protesting today want their right to live and work in Britain guaranteed, not later in talks, now. In coming days, ministers will be pressed to agree. But here were over 50,000 letters demanding the law to get Brexit started should be passed quickly with no changes, an argument supported by some who campaigned against it.
I voted to remain in the European Union, but I support this bill because I believe the referendum was decisive.
A former Chancellor said no deal was better than a bad one.
As soon as it is clear that, sadly, our European Union partners won't accept our offer, we should move on. There is nothing to be gained by protracted and doomed negotiations.
Peers are just getting warmed up. They'll be talking till the early hours and tomorrow till midnight. Then, next week, the government may just lose votes on migrant rights and on the right of Parliament to demand a better deal. But if it comes to a test of who backs down, the The betting is the Lords won't defy the elected MPs or the referendum. Talks to quit the EU look like starting on schedule next month. But there's more wrangling to come, and that's just the start of Brexit. John Pienaar, BBC News, Westminster.
Our debate on the government's Brexit bill got underway in the House of Lords today. The bill went through the Commons unchanged, and peers have been urged by the government not to frustrate the will of the people. But the Conservatives don't have a majority in the upper house, and amendments have been tabled for debate. Our political editor is in Westminster. Gary, is it riveting there?
About 3 out of 24 first speakers in this debate were actually Brexiteers. This is not a cross-section of society we're listening to in the House of Lords. At one point, the Prime Minister came in, probably just to keep an eye on things. It's not unheard of for Prime Ministers to come in. Some peers muttered about it being a little bit passive-aggressive. Was she trying to stare them down, daring them to change her treasured bill? But Edward Heath, I understand, actually came in and watched the original passage of Britain into the common market. So a certain symmetry there. You do get some Leaver speaking, like Nigel Lawson, the former Chancellor. He was talking about how it wouldn't matter that much if there wasn't a deal at all. And before him, you'll hear these two clips now. One of the most prominent Remainers, former Trade Secretary, former European Commissioner, Peter Mandelson.
Yes, they did want to leave the European Union, but they didn't want to turn Britain into a poorer, politically isolated offshore tax haven.
As soon as it is clear that, sadly, our European Union partners won't accept our offer, we should move on. There is nothing to be gained by protracted and doomed negotiations.
So are their lordships going to make any difference, Gary?
Well, if what Theresa May was trying to convey with that stare was "you dare," the answer is they probably don't. The lordships are probably going to vote for 2 amendments at least, which will then go back to the House of Commons and be voted down. Those are on rights of EU citizens who are resident here, and what they see as the need for a vote that could push a Commons Parliament vote that could push Theresa May back into the negotiations if they don't like the shape of what she's already negotiated. But as I say, the Commons will vote those down. At most, they're probably going to end up delaying the whole process by about a week, so probably not make an enormous amount of difference unless they extract concessions from the government along the way, but the Commons tried that and didn't get that far.
All right, Gary, thanks very much. John.
Now to a highly unusual appearance in the House of Lords. At the top, in the centre of frame here, you might be able to spot none other than the Prime Minister, keeping an eye on the Lords' debate on Brexit. She is sitting at the bottom of the Queen's throne, as she's entitled to do as a Privy Councillor, though, as it happens, we can't recall the last time any Prime Minister did so. The focus of the debate was on what happens to EU citizens currently living here. There are 3 million EU nationals living in the UK in total, about 5% of the population. Peers are debating a Labour amendment to the Brexit bill which guarantees their legal rights, particularly their right to be a permanent resident of the UK. Also on the table is an amendment to allow MPs a meaningful vote, as they put it, on the final Brexit deal.
When the Prime Minister heads to Parliament, her usual haunt is the House of Commons. But this afternoon she took a bit of a detour to the House of Lords, perching below the throne used by the Queen for the state opening of Parliament to listen to the arguments over triggering Article 50. Her presence didn't go unnoticed.
The welcome we extend to not just all noble lords who are here, but of course, indeed, to those distinguished guests visiting from the other place here today.
A guest who might be attempting to influence the debate. She doesn't have a majority here. Labour's message was, we won't be intimidated.
We will not be threatened into not fulfilling our normal constitutional role, and neither will we be goaded into acting irresponsibly. We have to have a serious and a responsible debate. And in doing so, if we ask the House of Commons to look again at an issue, it is not a constitutional outrage, but a constitutional responsibility.
But this former Tory leader who backed Remain offered strong support for getting on with the process.
Asking people to rise up to fight Brexit, which was the words a few days ago of the former Prime Minister Tony Blair are a great mistake. Now, I have enormous respect for him, more than many in his own party have.
But on this occasion, he said Mr Blair was quite wrong. Lord Mandelson, a former EU commissioner, backed Mr Blair's call to arms.
I was a Remainer, not, I might say, because of my pension rights, but because I am a patriot.
Of particular concern to some, the future of EU citizens in Britain.
Are we really and truly contemplating even the remote possibility that we will be prepared to start knocking on the doors, whether at midnight or midday, and expelling them from the United Kingdom?
Whatever Mrs May hoped to achieve by visiting the House of Lords today, it seems she has little to fear from their deliberations. While they may try to amend the legislation on triggering Article 50, Labour have made clear they don't intend to block it or even delay it. At best, they hope to extract a government concession on the rights of EU citizens, but that still looks unlikely. Libby Wiener, News at 10, Westminster.